My name is Johanna Levenson Fitzpatrick. I was born in Birmingham, Alabama, March 19th, 1946. You can do the math. I grew up in Birmingham, which was a very interesting experience, to say the least, if you can kind of put the time frame in there. My parents were divorced when I was very young, and I was raised by my father, who was, without a doubt, I think, the world's most wonderful person. And he is really the one that sort of pushed me to believe, back in the dark ages, that I could do anything I wanted. I mean, that's just the way he would put it. You know, you can do anything you want to do as long as you work hard. And so I think I probably was very, very attached to my dad.
And what was your father's name?
His name was Alfred Edward Levenson, and everybody called him Babe. And he was really I guess you would say he was a second generation American. He was born here in 1900, and his parents had immigrated from Russia and Germany, you know, during the late 1800s. He had to stop working when he was about in the 8th grade during World War I so he could help support his family, and he never went back to school, so he really had an 8th grade education. So education for him was a very important thing. But what he was an unbelievable businessman. And he became a real entrepreneur and had a department store in Birmingham. And so this person who worked very hard every day of his life, he could never think of retiring. He never retired. Found really his perfect niche. And I think that was sort of one of the great gifts he gave me, was to look for maybe what would be my perfect niche in life.
What was the name of the department store?
Tillman Levenson. And it was, I don't know if you know Loehmann's and those kinds of stores, but it was a store like that way ahead of its time. It was a discount department store. And I was a bit of a princess. You know, I have an older brother, Russell, who's about 9 years older than I am. But really, by the time I came along, I was like an only child. And I spent a lot of time at the department store. What they would do is they would go, my father would go out and he would bid on deals. And it might be a fire stock, or it might be a water damage, or it might be an overstock store. But it really was one of the first discount stores in the country. And there's actually a book that talks about how those stores developed, Loehmann's and Tillman Levenson and the Bargain Center in Quincy. And they were all started by, Jewish merchants who had to find a different way to do things in those days. So I will tell you that periodically I would go to school and I smell like smoke, but I got over it. You just had to hope that it didn't rain. Yeah. But he was a wonderful, wonderful influence on me.
So did you have a chance to work in the store?
I really never worked in the store. My brother graduated from the University of Alabama and eventually went into the business, and he worked at the store. But I really didn't. If you ask my husband, he always said, people said, well, what was your first job? And he would say, oh, she was a circuit court judge. That's not exactly true, but, not too far off either. Mm-hmm. But I sort of knew that was not where I was going to end up in my career, so I didn't really ever work in the store.
Now, was this store similar to a lot of stores that catered to both a black and a white clientele?
Well, I'll tell you, it's interesting that you asked that. Primarily, the clientele was black in Birmingham, and also sort of we would call it the over the mountain, the upper crusty people would come in there because they like to go and shop and get, the ball gowns and one thing or another that they would get in a deal. But my dad was one of the first people in Birmingham to have, I won't call them African Americans or blacks, work in the store in sales positions. And I just remember one of the big, and we probably can talk about this because, this was the days of Bull Connor and all the other things. And my dad I can't say that he would have ever articulated that he was a great liberal in any way, but he was a man who just knew right from wrong, and he always treated people wonderfully, kindly. Everybody called him Mr. Babe. That he would sit in the front of the store and everybody, oh, Mr. Babe, how are you? Oh, Mr. Babe, how are you? And he just liked people, and he hired people for positions based on, were they good people? Did they do the work? And I remember, I can't tell you the exact year, but I think I was a sophomore or in high school. He just called one Saturday and said, you can't come down today. Don't come downtown today. Because I'm assuming it was the Klan, it was somebody had firebombed the store because they didn't like his choice of where he put people. And, that's how life was in Birmingham in those days. It was really a very, and I'm sure you've read books about it too, it was a very closed society. And, we were Jewish, and being Jewish is not all that different than being black in those days. I mean, it was still a very segregated, cut and dried society there. But that's really, one of the memories I have of him. He just said, very calmly, I think this is, not a good day to come downtown today. We had a little incident, and then of course you hear about it later.
Yeah.
But
before we go on, I'd like to know a little bit about your mother. What was your mother's name?
My mother's name was Marie Jones. She was a beautiful woman. She was not mentally healthy. I think that's probably the best way to put it. And I didn't really have that much contact with her, probably after I was the age of, in the 6th or 7th grade. And then when we got older, I got older and was married, and my husband and I spent a year or so in Birmingham after college. She kind of came back into the life again. And she was just one of those people who I think had a very difficult life growing up. She was the daughter of a Baptist minister in the South, and probably a very strict family. And I think she just ended up being damaged, and it was hard. My father always took very good care of her. He built her a house in South Alabama where she lived, and went back and lived with her family. But really, I can't say that we had as much contact with her over the years, probably as maybe we would if she had lived longer. She died when she was 58, so she did not have a very long life.
When was she born?
Let's see, she was 11 years younger than my father, so 1911. That was it. She was 11 years younger than him.
And where did they meet?
Well, it's kind of interesting. They met in Norfolk, Virginia. She was a model, and she modeled hand gloves and hand, for magazines. And he was on business up there, and we have pictures of their earliest times. I think they met in Norfolk. And then ended up going back to Birmingham. She went to Birmingham, and eventually they got married. I'm trying to think, obviously it was in the 30s, the late 30s when they got married, because my father was 46 when I was born. And I think it was probably the late 30s. And her father was a Baptist minister, and my father's father was a Jewish cantor. And evidently both families treated them like they had died in the beginning, and but eventually kind of got together. And there must have been some unbelievable conversations in the kitchen over the years, I think. But that I have a little bit of a memory of going down to South Alabama, where her family was from, a place called Clayhatchee, which is near Dothan. And it was just a completely different life than the big city in Birmingham. It was a very different life there.
What made your parents settle in Birmingham?
Well, I think my father had traveled all, around the country, doing business deals and everything. He used to tell one story about they lived in California, before he married my mother. He was a bit of an adventurer, and he used to make his living by playing cards. And
poker?
Yes, and one of his stories was I think he played poker and gin and everything else there is there. He would play cards with Howard Hughes, so back in the 20s and 30s in California. I think he may have been, he was, I think, a very handsome man. He may have been a bit of a rake, but eventually he moved to Birmingham. His father and mother moved to Birmingham. He had a brother that lived in Birmingham, and then another brother that lived in Miami, and two sisters, one in New York and one in California. So they were kind of spread out a little bit.
So were any of his relatives involved with his business as well?
Not really. That was what he did. One of his brother that lived in Miami became a businessman in a different way. He ended up owning the Flagler dog track down in Miami. His two sisters, I don't think ever worked. I think they were married. And then he had another brother, Jack, who did some sort of business deals on his own. But he was the only one I know of that had a store.
That's very interesting. Now, when you were in Birmingham growing up, what school did you attend?
I went to Crestline Elementary, which was within walking distance of our house. Of course, they were all segregated schools. That's what it was then. Then I went to Mountain Brook Junior High, a new school, and then Shades Valley High School, which is it was the biggest high school in Birmingham at the time. And I'd like to tell this story. I'm probably jumping ahead of you for whatever you were going to ask, but I was sort of a big, athletic, smart girl, not exactly the Southern belle that you think of in Birmingham. And I knew early on that I thought I wanted to be a doctor. That was what I was sort of aiming for. And I remember talking to Miss Hightower, who was our guidance counselor there, and she asked me, where I wanted to go to school, meaning usually Alabama or Auburn. That was sort of what the deal was. I said, well, I think I want to go north to school, because I had gone to summer camp in Maine for many years, and I loved New England. And she said, oh, really? And I said, yeah. And, I named a couple of schools. And she says, well, what do you want to do when you get through doing this? And I said, well, I think I want to be a doctor. And she says, well, why would you want to do that? You'll just take up a space that's for some man. And I said, oh, well, I don't really think that's right, but that's what I think I want to do. But that really was the attitude. And then many years later, we were talking before you got here, I guess after you were here, about high school reunions. I went back to one of my high school reunions, and by that time I was a judge. And she actually came up to me, and she had remembered the conversation too, and said, I really want to tell you, I was wrong. So that was interesting, kind of what goes around comes around, I guess.
That is quite interesting. When you were in these different segregated schools, did you feel any prejudice, or did you get a sense from...
You mean because I was Jewish?
Because you were Jewish, and also the general atmosphere, because of course Birmingham was...
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
central.
It was... I always I said that Birmingham in those days was like living in New Delhi, because it was such a caste system. And I was, in a way, I was a bit of an odd duck, because I had friends who were not Jewish and friends who were Jewish. And in those days, there was no, or very little overlap. I mean, I'm trying to think of a nice way to say it, but there really isn't. There was very little overlap. But when high school came along, sororities were very big in the South in those days, sororities and fraternities. And it was very clear to me that, the girls who were not Jewish, the Christian girls, were all going to be in sororities, and as close as we were, it was never going to happen. And I thought, this just isn't right. And I'll also tell you, and I think if you read books about Birmingham, of course, the most involved people with the civil rights movements were Jewish in those days. And I think probably that spurred me on to leaving. I knew I didn't want to stay there. And I felt like it was just a much too closed environment for me. My family was not as active as some, although I feel like maybe I was. But injustice doesn't necessarily take a corner and just stay there. It covers everything. And so if you see prejudice in terms of how you're treated, if you're Jewish and basically a Christian society, you see how black people are treated in a basically white society, it doesn't take much of a leap to figure it out. And so I think that really had a big impact on what I did eventually. That and the fact that I was definitely not going to be a good doctor, since I'm not sure I could have ever made it through the sciences in college. But I think it had a huge impact on me, and it had an impact on what I decided to do and how I decided to do it.
When did you begin, I guess, having a consciousness about this inequity?
I would say very young. I'd say, before high school, You mean in terms of just my own personal? I think it's just there. There were Jewish clubs and non-Jewish clubs and the sororities and the fraternities. Now I have an older brother, Russell Levenson, who is not Jewish, has never been Jewish, and has went completely the other route. And in fact, he has a son who's an Episcopal minister. We love it, Father Levenson. That's the. In fact, he's the minister of George Bush Sr.'s church in Texas. That always sort of is a big hoot to me, but a wonderful, wonderful family. But, I have to say that my views of Birmingham are very, colored by growing up. And whenever you would go back there, the first thing people will say, oh, is it so different now? Maybe it's different. Maybe it is. I hope it is. But, I just knew that that was not where I was going to stay.
Did you ever talk about these ideas that you had with your father?
Oh, yeah. Now, he was, my dad is I would think, probably much more conservative politically than I am, although, of course, as a judge, you have no politics. Mm-hmm. But I would say he would probably be conservative on some issues, but not on human issues. I think we were always on the same page with that. And really, for me, the lesson I learned from him was you treat everybody nicely. There's no reason to treat anybody without respect. And I think that's the lesson that sometimes gets lost in an environment like that. Because if you're in such a hierarchical system, it's okay to be really nice to everybody here, but you can be a little less nice here and a little less nice here. And that just was never the way I think he approached life, and hopefully, I approach life.
When you were in school, were there any teachers or anyone in the community, in addition to your father, who really helped to frame your mindset or challenge you in some ways to make you move forward in a very different direction than maybe you would have gone before?
It's interesting. I would say my view is the teachers that I had in school there were not the kind of teachers that necessarily would have pushed a young woman into any kind of career like we're talking about now, to be honest with you. I remember when John Kennedy was shot, I was in advanced placement history with Mr. Parker. I can't remember his first name now. And of course, when this happened, we were terribly upset. At least some of us in the class were, but some of them were not. And I remember the one thing he said is, well, this just goes to show you that you can't legislate the conscience of a people. And I thought, what does that man mean? But I knew it was not a good thing that he was saying that. And it really sort of colored my view of high school. I always, was a good student. I did sports. I did everything there was to do. But I really feel like my education came primarily from books. I had a wonderful family. My friend, the Nichols, she's still a very good friend of mine, Joan Nichols Wolf. Her family, Fred and Jeanette Nichols, were really almost my surrogate mother. And I spent a great deal of time at their house. And they were probably the ones that were, in terms of Enlightenment, politics, race relations. That's where we would sit around the table and talk. And they were really quite good. In fact, her younger brother, Michael, wrote a book about Robert Kennedy as his thesis when he was at Brown that eventually was published. When Nicholas Katzenbach came to Birmingham during the desegregation days and that. So that was really an environment that I would have to say probably was as important to me as any educational environment there. I just went with the program. I did my work, I got my stuff, I read my own books. We had, I think among our friends we always talked about things like that, but I can't say that the educational system in Birmingham pushed anything too forward for me.
Were there any books at that particular time that really resonated with you?
Oh, I just read everything. We had a library at the grammar school. I remember when I was in there, and in the summer, I did go to summer camp for many, I think from the time I was 6 till I was about 15 or so, 16. But I would just go, I might read 5 or 6 books a week. You just go sit down there and read them. Primarily fiction, and I loved history. I would read history. I remember I went through a period of time where I just was doing presidents, and Thomas Jefferson and Lincoln were the two that jumped out at me, and I think I had a summer of Jefferson and Lincoln. But books themselves, I can't even tell you the titles because I still read a million books today. It's what I do. Mm-hmm. And I remember when I went back to Birmingham for a period of time after graduating from college, and I taught in a high school. I taught in an all-black high school, Parker High School, which is closed up afterwards. And we couldn't get books. We had no books. And I taught civics. I was a substitute teacher. I taught civics for 7.5 months out of the New York Times, which I would buy, and magazines. And that's, I was thinking at the time about the kids there. I wanted to go buy books, but we didn't have any money either, so we just did it that way. Mm-hmm. But I think books to me were the door openers for a young kid there.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any occasion to have a lot of interaction with the African American community while you were growing up?
Well, the interaction was we had maids, mm-hmm. and they were all African American. Mm-hmm. We had yard men. They were all African American. The people that worked at my father's store, were the people I saw the most, and they were they were in all different positions there. But my favorite thing to do as a child would be to go back to the alterations department, where they had 4 African American women work there who did alterations. And I would spend time. They taught me how to iron, how to sew. I would sit back in there. We would laugh and talk, and I would think those were probably, Mary, Suzanne, and Jane were probably the most friendly on a one-to-one basis that I have. And then I'll give you the most ironic part to this, which is I went to Tufts to college, and I was doing a biology project where you had a partner. And with me, with the partner, was a young black man named Genoa A. Montgomery. I came from the Birmingham public schools. I was scared to death because everybody there was, way smarter than me and had gone to Exeter, Andover, and Choate. And we get there, and a nice young man, and we are friends, and we're talking, and I make him do all the cutting because by that time I'd figured there's no way I'm going to be a doctor. I'm moving on to other things. And I said to him, and I had a southern accent, probably much more than I do now, so where are you from? And he says, well, I grew up in Birmingham. I said, you grew up in Birmingham? Oh, my word, I grew up in Birmingham. And he says, oh, yeah. He says, I was there, but I was sent away to prep school by A.G. Gaston, who ran the A.G. Gaston funeral homes there and hotels. And what he would do is he'd pick 5 or 6, very bright young black men and send them north to prep schools. And they were to go away, get educated, and then come back for a while or whatever. I said, oh, isn't that amazing? And as it turns out, Genoa A. Montgomery was the son of our mailman. And, we were friends forever after that, But I mean, that's the ironies of life. I came out of the Birmingham public school scared to death and struggling. Genoa had gone to Choate and was just, moving right on in there. And eventually, I think he became a lawyer too. He went to the University of Chicago and became a lawyer, and I'm sure is doing great things. But it's a tiny world.
Yeah. When you were in high school, you had to make a decision about where you would go and whether you go to medical school and all of this, and I assume that you were still thinking of medical school while you were in high school.
Right.
Did you feel that as a female that you had perhaps more barriers against achieving that goal?
Yeah. Get out of here. Oh yeah. They in those days there were very, very few women that were really thinking about, I would call them, the outside the box careers. And one thing that I felt like I was in some ways a very privileged person. We had enough money. I was able to do what I wanted to do. My father sent me to camp in the summers, which I loved. Really gave you a different perspective from people from all over the country.
What kind of camps?
I went to a summer camp in Maine. It was an all-Jewish camp. It was the greatest thing that ever happened. You played every sport there was known to man. I became a tennis player. I'm still a tennis player today. It was a great experience, but it really introduced you to people outside the world that I lived in. It was a wonderful experience. But I decided early on that, this sort of sounds trite now because we've talked about it. Everybody talks about it, but that I really felt like I ought to give back. I wanted to do something. I knew I was never going to, and I was lucky because I knew that, I was never going to starve, to be honest with you. And that if I wanted to go to a really good college, and could get in, I'd be able to do it. If I wanted to go to because my father encouraged me. It wasn't a teacher, it wasn't a guidance counselor. He said, you can do anything you want, but you just have to do it. And then when I went to Tufts in Boston, which is a wonderful school. I loved every minute I was there. That was a very different attitude. There were many young women who were either going to go to law school or med school or whatever. The first day my feet hit the ground there, I said, I am really happy here. I like this place. I like the teachers. I like the courses. I like the attitude. And I think it was I was very lucky to end up there.
What year was it that you went there, and why did you select Tufts?
I started college in 1964. I knew I wanted to go to New England, which was very, I don't know who else went from my high school that went away. I actually wanted to go to Wellesley, and I did not get in. I got the thin envelope, and when I was up there looking at schools before that, I'd looked at Pembroke, Barnard, Wellesley, Tufts, and Mount Holyoke. And I really liked Wellesley. I thought Wellesley the best. It was an all women's school then. And then Tufts was my second choice. And I got into Tufts. And it was a great, I'm a big believer in things happen the way they're supposed to. And it was just a fabulous place for me. It was a great fit. Jackson College was the women's part of Tufts, but it was sort of all mixed into one. And so you had classes with men and women, but you had a separate sort of administrative issue that let the girls feel special too. And it just was a great place. It was the education for me that I'd always wanted and never really found in that, Mountain Brook High School or Shades Valley High School environment. It was a great place.
Yeah, let me back up just a little bit and ask you about your senior year of high school. Did you have a favorite subject?
Oh yeah, I always loved English. English first, history second. And I did have a nice English teacher. Her name was Miss Arnold. She was kind of elderly at the time, but she liked me because I liked to read. And so I think from a teacher's point of view, or from a relationship point of view, she was really a very nice lady. She was, I think, probably one of the people that wrote my recommendations for college. But my stronger subjects were, the liberal arts subjects, English, I would say French, but that would be a stretch. History, and that really is probably where I should have always thought I wanted to be, but somehow the idea of a doctor gave me the thought that you could do more for people until, a little bit farther down the line.
Do you know when your first idea came about wanting to help people in that way? Do you know what stirred that?
I think just living in the environment that we did. I mean, that was... I just felt like there ought to be something that I could do that would kind of make it a better place. And I wasn't one, although I did get married very young. We'll get to that, I guess. But I really never thought about getting married and having a family. I really thought about what kind of work am I going to do that I'm going to do the rest of my life. And the first thought was I was going to go to medical school. And Tufts really has a wonderful medical school, and that was how we sort of honed in on that. And then once I decided, let's really look at what your talents might be, that's how I got to the next step, because, the law is a way you can truly make a difference. And that was sort of how we got there.
Your senior year was the year of Bull Connor.
Oh, yeah.
Tell me a little bit about your view of that year.
Well, it's interesting. As a teenager, your high school is just your high school, and it goes on no matter what. But the church bombings, and I think they might have been in 63, but maybe it was 64.
No, 63.
But that was a big part of life. Now, everything that you would see in the newspapers here, the pictures and on television, it was so low-keyed there. It was almost like you had to have an underground to know all the stuff that was really going on. But obviously it had a huge impact. For some people it was, it depends on maybe who you were talking to, but among my friends it was a horrible set of circumstances. And I think maybe there were many people that were motivated to do one thing or another, but it certainly motivated me.
Did you ever go downtown and see any of the marches?
I have to say, once we tried to do that, and the streets were blocked. My friend Joan Nichols, you really couldn't get there. I mean, you couldn't get there. And everything we sort of saw was filtered through either word of mouth or the little bit that you'd get on national news. I mean, obviously the big stories, the Pettus Bridge, all that stuff you would see. But you just knew what was going on. And, Bull Connor, it's like whenever you think about this guy, the picture of evil is, it's just amazing. I can see him today. I can see his face. I can see his stance. I remember what it was. But you really felt, I think, in that environment fairly incapable of doing too much. It really just was you went to school, you did your stuff, you looked at, oh, this is terrible, but when am I going to get to a spot that I can make a difference and do something?
Did your father ever talk with you about what was going on?
Oh, yeah, he did. We had dinner conversations at dinner, and I think his deal was, he was always afraid for me, to be honest. His deal is we just do what's right in our family. We do what's right in our business, and things are going to be all right.
Did you ever talk with any of the people who worked in the store who were African American about it?
No. I didn't. Mm-mm. And I don't know that they would have felt comfortable doing it. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. And I think in those, it's just such a different environment now that where you see. If you ask my children or you ask my grandchildren, this is like, what do you? It's like such ancient history. Well, why would you even think there'd be an issue like that? But I think in those days it just wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was a very different environment. And I imagine, you talked about Jim Benton. Jim Benton and I have talked a lot over the years about his experiences and my experiences and the overlaps and what it is. And, he was one of the boys that left and went north. Mm-hmm. He was, as he says, he was one of the lucky ones. And I feel like I was a lucky one, too, because my father wanted me to basically stay in Birmingham and live an easy life. It would be an easy life to live there for us. But we took a little bit of a different tact.
But you had the idea that once you left, you were leaving?
Yeah. I was never going back. I wasn't. And my husband and I went back for 1 year after college because my father had a stroke. And we went back there. He's from Boston, and thought we would, see what we could do there. In fact, I can tell you it was 1968 because we were the ones that ran the Hubert Humphrey campaign in Birmingham. There were like 3 of us. And we had both worked for Bobby Kennedy when we were in college in New England, and went down to Birmingham. We didn't know how long it was going to be, but it turned out we stayed for about 68. We came up here in 1970. By that time, my father was fine, and we left, came up here.
Tell me a little bit about college. After, I suppose, your first year, you decided that medicine was not...
Really, it was even sooner than that. It's a liberal arts school, so you start out with kind of everything. And once I got up there and sort of really started thinking a little bit, maybe more clearly about roads to take, I began... I really enjoyed the English and the history and the political science. And I think it was really after the first semester that I decided probably I was not going to be one of the medical school people. And, where was I going to go from there? And that's when I sort of focused on the law. And I had, during when I was growing up, one of my heroes was Frank Johnson, who was a judge in Montgomery at that time, who basically did the integration of the schools in the South. And he had a rough road to hoe, but he was sort of my example there. And I thought, there weren't a lot of women examples in those days. And so I decided, well, I think I'll try law school and, see where that takes me. And that was the road that I took. I did primarily history, political science, and English once I got through with the dreaded science and math, and went on from there.
Were there any professors at that time who really influenced you?
Tufts was fabulous in terms of the teachers. There was one professor named Robert Legvold, and Tufts was also affiliated with Harvard in this Fletcher School of International Diplomacy, and we kind of sucked some of their professors away back and forth, and Professor Legvold was one of those. And he was just basically, I took several courses from him that had to do with, politics, Eastern European politics, and it just really was our history of, I want to call it prejudice is mirrored in the rest of the world. It's not unique to us, and it was much more of a global perspective than I'd ever had before. So I really thought he was a great example for me.
Now, you encountered someone while you were at Tufts who would become an important part of your life?
My husband, Chuck. Oh, yes.
Tell me a little bit about how you met.
Well, I can't tell you how I met because we have 2 completely different stories about how we met from that. But my freshman year, and you can probably tell from what we discussed, I was the person that went to every class. I read every book. I read every paper. We had 8 o'clock English. And I was so scared coming from the Birmingham public schools that I was just going to be a complete washout there with all these people who'd gone to, very different places. And about halfway through the semester, the professor said, "Has anybody seen Mr. Fiztpatrick?" I looks around and said, "No." Okay. So it was an 8 o'clock class. I think maybe he came a little bit, but not too much. But at the end of the time, we took our tests, we get our grades. I get a B, Mr. Fiztpatrick gets a B+. I'm trying to figure out, what is wrong with this story. But eventually, I meet him the next year because I have a car. He's hitchhiking back from Harvard Square. My college roommate and I picked them up, he and his friend, and the rest is history. It turned out he had every class with me, and he actually did go to classes then. And we got married the next summer, I think it was.
So you were in your second
After we
year?
finished our sophomore year and got married. And so we were married our junior year and senior year.
That must have been difficult.
It was difficult. It was very different than I think a lot of people did. And we had our son Bill the spring of I guess it was our junior year. And so, we juggled classes, and I'd go to school Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and he'd go Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. That was our daycare. And he worked, he worked jobs, and, I took care of the baby and went to school. And it was the last 2 years were kind of a different college experience. But, you just do it because you're young, and that's what you do. And I think that's why our son Bill, he's the one that's the lawyer. It was just so well adjusted because, you went here today and there tomorrow, and, that's what it was.
Did you know at the time that you met your husband, really met him, that he was interested in law?
I don't know about that, but I can tell you, we've been married now 43 years, which is an amazing statistic, I think. But somehow, when you're young, 19, 20 years old, you have no idea about, what the rest of your life is going to be. But really, we got to know each other very well because we did. We had every class together. We spent every, kind of waking moment together for a long time. And I think sort of philosophically and all, we were always on the same page. And he is really the one that pushed me after, I had Bill, and, he was already in law school. He says, no, you have to go to law school. This is what you were, you wanted to do this. This is what it's necessary for you to do. You'll make your contribution with our family, but you've got more things to do. So he was a tremendous, I would say, push to me finishing what I'd hoped to, to do. He really is a spectacular. I always tell people, I'm all form and he's all substance. That's why we've managed to make it so long.
Between the two of you, who had the inspiration to go to law school first?
Well, he went first. I think we were both going to go, but we couldn't do it at the same time. We didn't have enough money. And we ended up in Birmingham right when we graduated from college, very unexpectedly. He was going to go to law school, begin in Boston, and I was going to teach school while he finished, and then I was going to go. And then my father got sick, and so we ended up going to Birmingham really quickly. And he started at a law school down there, Samford Law School, which, I wouldn't say was the best experience for him. And so we stayed down there for a couple of years and then moved up to Washington. He got a job on Capitol Hill and transferred to Catholic Law School. And so at that juncture, I was sort of getting into I'm doing Bill and thinking about what I'm going to do. And he was all over me. Nope, you got to take the law boards. You take the law boards. Then you apply to law school. You do this. And that's kind of how it developed. So he finished first. I think when I started, he had 1 semester to go.
And so you entered law school in what year?
I started in 1971 and finished in 74.
Now, did you choose Catholic University Law School because he was there, or?
No. I chose it because it was the only place that would sort of let me do a schedule where we could find child care. And at that time, the head of Catholic Law School was a man named Dean Clinton Bamberger, who had been John Kennedy's first legal services director. And I thought at that time I wanted to be a legal aid lawyer. That was what I was looking for. And they had this wonderful program at Catholic where they had the storefront legal aid office that you could work where you could work during law school and then actually take your last semester and work there full time, which is what I did. But part of the reason was really they allowed me to be a little flexible. And they used to have section A, B, and C, and he let me sort of drift a little bit. But I took all the same courses, finished in the same time. But they just really wanted to have a more diverse law school. There were very few women, if any. I'm trying to think how many were in our class, maybe 3 or 4. Very few people of color. I mean, this was just the beginning of some change. So, you know, it was interesting. It was an interesting time there.
Did you know when you entered law school that legal aid was something that you wanted, or was it simply just finding a place in law that would allow you to?
I think really I thought I was going to become a legal aid lawyer because, you know, doing legal services for poor people sort of was a kind of fit in with what I thought would be a nice life's work. It would be, you know, doing something that you like, that's challenging, that is good for people. I guess one of the things, I've really never been driven by money. That's not something that, you know, I never thought in my wildest dreams that I wanted to go and be a corporate lawyer or work at a big law firm. It just wasn't sort of the way that I saw myself. And I always tell the story when we first moved up here. We went to a movie down at DuPont Circle on a Saturday night. It was a late movie. And we walked past, there was a law firm called Arnold & Porter that was in a big, beautiful building down there. And the library was in the basement, and we walked by the side of the building to get to the movie theater. And we walked by going to the movie at, 8 o'clock on a Saturday night or 9 o'clock on a Saturday night, and it was filled with young people working. And when we came back from the movie, and the movie was Cesar and Rosalie, I remember that, we walked back from the movie, and they were still down there, 12:30 or 1. I said, you know, I don't think this is what I want to do. I think I want to do something a little bit different. And, I guess that, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I mean, obviously it's a great career for many people, but that just really wasn't what I wanted to do. And my husband Chuck was interested in politics, so he worked for it was HEW then, but he really wanted to work on Capitol Hill, and so that was sort of the way he was heading, and that was the way I was heading.
Would you see yourself in some way influenced by the promises of the Kennedy administration then?
We were both, I would say, Chuck is from Boston. He was a Kennedy file from the get-go. My brother, who's in Birmingham, is completely different in terms of his view of the world and my view of the world, but we both were very committed to Bobby Kennedy back in the late 60s when he was running. And I would say that probably did have a lot to do with it, the idea of making a change and making a difference, and being able to do something that would benefit people, but also let you feel fulfilled yourself. And legal aid to me was, I probably would have been happy staying at legal aid. I really liked it. I like people. I like sort of the dealing with people one-on-one.
After law school, what did you do? Or actually your last year when you're really looking at possible positions?
Well, I knew I wanted to work in legal aid. And so I sort of, and in those days it was the Legal Services Corporation. And so I looked around, and there were very few legal aids right then. Fairfax had one. I'm not even sure if Arlington had one, but I knew we lived in Virginia. I wanted to be a Virginia lawyer. I was going to take the Virginia bar. So I basically interviewed at Fairfax, and I think 2 others, but I can't remember where. It might have been Arlington and Alexandria, but whatever. But anyway, I interviewed at Fairfax, and just loved it. They had a wonderful board of directors, and we got through, and this is kind of a long story, but the long and the short of it is there were several people on the board who wanted to hire me, and then there was one person on the board who later became a judge after me, who said, yeah, her credentials are the best and she has the history and everything, but we really need to give it to the guy who needs a job. Okay? And so when they first came in, they said, well, we're going to interview other people. And I said, well, that's fine. I said, but just know that if I don't get it, I'm just going to keep coming back until you give it to me. And they offered me the job, the next week. And I started at Legal Aid. That was the first job I had out of law school. And I just loved it. It was really good.
What were some of the cases or the situations you were in that you representing clients that really resonated with you?
Well, I really do. I'm very interested in people. I like people, and in legal aid, it's not like any case that comes in is an easy case, because you're primarily dealing with people who either have big time problems. They can't read, they can't write, they have no money, they're being evicted, they can't, it's a divorce, it's a very specific kind of law that you're practicing. You're a little bit lawyer, you're a little bit social worker, you're a little bit mother, it's very all encompassing. But I did, at our legal aid office in those days, you could take court appointments. So I did criminal law, I did guardian ad litems appointed through the courts, we did divorces, we did a lot of child abuse, and I got very involved in the child abuse, sort of revamping the Virginia Code. In fact, I did a little talk not too long ago about Bob Shepard, who was a wonderful professor at the University of Richmond, and he is really the father of all things children in Virginia law. And I worked with him on the revamping the code dealing with neglect and abuse back in the 70s, and that was something that was a great interest to me. I guess you could say my biggest success at legal aid is what got me on the bench to begin with, and it was at Catholic we had a law professor named Florence Roisman, who was a property person who was just, tremendously active in terms of her approach to cases. And in those days, you had all kinds of due process, equal protection issues, Goldberg versus Kelly kinds of issues that we were very attuned to at our legal aid clinic at Catholic. And it wasn't the traditional property courses that you took where, you're learning. I had to learn those on the bar exam. Because we really did different things. And in Fairfax, I had a case in which a young woman had been evicted from the public housing in Fairfax County. And my training from Florence Roisman said, ooh, they have due process problems. So we went to court, and in the lower court, in the district court, the trial court obviously disagreed and entered judgment and evicted her, and I said nope, my appeal, which nobody ever does for those things. And so we got to circuit court, and on the other side of the case was Senator Abe Brault, who was the Democratic senator, and I think it was Senator Brault and somebody in his firm, but they represented the housing authority. And we took it up there, and I made all these arguments, which I don't think anybody has ever made in Fairfax County before or since. Thank you, Florence Roisman. And I believe it was Judge Keith agreed with me, and they had to revamp their entire housing eviction procedures for poor people in the county. And about, a year or two later, I got a call that asked if I wanted to be a substitute judge from the chief judge of the court at that time. And I think Senator Brault had called because he really did think it was time they put some women on the bench. So I became the first woman substitute judge in Fairfax County. And then 2 years later, I went on the juvenile bench.
When you first were appointed as a substitute judge, mm-hmm. and you were the first woman, mm-hmm. what was that like? Because you've been facing some form of discrimination as mm-hmm. a female all your life. Did you
Well, it was.
Do you find some of, I mean, not
yeah.
necessarily discrimination, but perhaps attitude
Well, I mean,
issues?
honestly, absolutely. And I mean, I can't wait to interview Barbara Keenan, because, I mean, we used to have we used to go to the Fairfax bar lunches, and we would be, the only two young women there. There were actually a couple of older women who had been around for a long time, Kalita Carroll and, I can't think of the other woman's name. I can't think of her right now. But, I mean, it definitely is different. First of all, you would go there, the men's rooms for the judges are all men's rooms, I mean, that's what that was. But, and I think in the beginning, it was a big shock. I mean, it was just so different then. I remember I had one lawyer tell me, if I made the ruling the way that I was playing, this is in general district court, I'd be overturning 200 years of Virginia jurisprudence. I just loved it. I said, well, that's the way it is. It is what it is. But, I think for a while in the beginning, obviously anytime you go in and you're the first of anything, whether you're the first juvenile judge or district judge or circuit judge, I mean, there's always, a little bit of how is this really going to work? But if you just work at it, then eventually it goes away. I mean, I always say being the first of this and $1 gets you a cup of coffee. I mean, it's a really big deal in the beginning, but then it becomes less of a deal every day that goes by. And I think it's important that, just like you say, we have people of color, that you see people of color on the bench. If you're a woman, you need to see a woman on the bench. It doesn't make, you don't do anything differently necessarily than any of your male colleagues, but it's really the perception and style. I'm sure my style is different than some of my male judge friends, and it's different than some of my female judge friends now. But in the beginning, I just think that and I always thought it was important that litigants know there is someone that may look a little bit like them that's up there, and not only old white men. I mean, that was what it was until that time.
What kind of perceptual change or impact do you think that has on people, really?
Well, I think now, I mean, in some ways, it's interesting because I think the young women who come on now really have not really a great perception of the history that went before. I mean, and that is a good thing. We've opened doors, and I think even though there's still some lurking issues out there, glass ceilings and law firms and things like that, I think that the perception is very different today. I don't think when somebody goes into the Fairfax court and sees Judge Roush now, they just say, oh, here's Judge Roush, she's a woman. It's Judge Roush. And I think that is a huge step. Or they go in our court and they see Judge Benton when he was sitting. He's not just a black judge, he's Judge Benton. And I think things have changed. I really have. Partly because of media, partly because of just the time that's gone by. But when you see what's going on with Sotomayor now, I mean, it's not, I think she's going to have a difficult time, but it's not just because she's a woman. I mean, I think things have changed.
When you first came onto the bench, do you remember any specific events that let you know that you were entering an all-male club?
Oh, yeah.
And can you give us an example or two?
Yes, I can. When you become a judge, you go down to what's called rookie school. And you need to follow up with Barbara Keenan because we are always a duet, and we appear to have done these things together. But we're down in rookie school in Richmond, and we're at the Holiday Inn. And this is after we've spent all day, learning what they have to teach you. How you run a courtroom. They have somebody come in and act up, and you're supposed to do one thing or another. But at any rate, Barbara and I are the only women there, of course, and we're sitting around it. I mean, she's on the district court, I'm on the juvenile court then, so this is 1982. And she is really young. I am not so young. And we're sitting around the table after it's over with, maybe having a drink or talking or whatever with a bunch of our colleagues. And this is true. one of the men who was there says to me, Judge Fitzpatrick, do you mind if I ask you a question? And I said, no, go ahead. I'm glad for you to ask me a question. He says, let me ask you this. He says, are you going to get paid the same that I'm going to get paid? And I thought, yeah. I said, well, yeah, I am. I said, yeah, but I think I'm probably going to be working 5 days a week as opposed to maybe 2, where, you know, that in the country. I said, yeah, we're going to get paid the same as you do. And he says, well, and are you going to wear a black robe every day? And I said, yeah. I asked them for a red one with an alligator, but they told me I had to wear a black one just like everybody else. Oh, yeah. And I am not kidding you. That is the conversation that went down. And I looked at Barbara and I thought, we are in for a long haul. This is the deal. But really, everybody turned out to be, we all got to be great friends over the time. And they had a little bit of I think it was a time warp. I mean, it was hard for them to see these 2 young women kind of come into the life where it had never been. And in a way, I think it was probably good that we were the 2, because...
Were you all also perhaps the youngest in this group?
I think there may have been some men that were about our age, in the early 30s. Most of them were older. But there were some that were. Barbara was very young. I think I was 34, maybe. I don't know. I can't even remember. It's a long time. Maybe 31. I can't even remember how old I was, but I know I was young. But it really wasn't the age thing, I don't think, as much as it was, the gender. That was true. And in the beginning, I think the wives were very unsure about us being in the environment with their husbands. I mean, it was just so bizarre to me. But the wives were very standoffish in the beginning, and then as they get to know you, it's just like anything else. Then it's not, but it's unusual. It was an unusual thing in those days.
Well, let me flip that script a little bit, because your husbands were in kind of a different position as well. How were they received?
Well, I can tell you that Chuck went with me to the first. I think it was judges meeting we had. It may have been out in Blacksburg, and they have spouse things, and the spouse thing was to tour a bakery or something, and that was the last time he ever went. I mean, it was just sort of there still were very few things, but but I think they were. I mean, everybody loves Chuck, and I think that I don't think Barb was married at the time, but. It was different for them. It was sort of a piece of cake.
When you were judging the juvenile court, first of all, how did you get that appointment, and what adjustments did you have to make as a judge? But also your outlook on things. Did it impact in any way?
It was a great job. There used to be a book called The Peter Principle. And I think I'm probably an example of the Peter Principle, because I was probably the best as a juvenile court judge. I really liked it. I liked dealing with the people. The very sad cases, there are no easy cases that come in. Even if they're routine type of issues, they're never an easy case. But I guess it really helped me sort of learn patience. It helps you sort of define and bring up what's important, and learn how to interview people. Probably the greatest lesson I learned from the juvenile court, which helped me in every level of court that I took, was how to listen, how to ask a question and really listen to an answer, and how you have to keep probing a little bit and be able to highlight the big issues from the little issues. I think the juvenile court, for me, and how did I get there, that was my interest. To be honest with you, when it came up, there were 2 possibilities, the general district court and the juvenile court, and I asked for the juvenile court because I thought that was what I would be really better doing. And I just loved it. I loved my colleagues at the time. They were wonderful people to work with. They were all men. Some had been there for a long time. And that's a place where you can really make a difference in a child's life. You know, and I think if you have good intuitions and good judgment about, people and how to look for what's going to work in their situation, it is a great laboratory for being a provider of good legal services. I thought the juvenile court was really a good one.
Do you think that you had an advantage that perhaps some of the other juvenile judges didn't have in perhaps just your overall attitude, or do you think it's just a learning process that every judge has to go through?
I think there's a learning process for a judge. I always tell people when, if you go on the circuit court or the Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court, there is a learning curve in which it takes you a while to learn how you really do things, how it really works, who you need to talk to. The first job you have as a judge is very important because it's completely different than being a lawyer. You're not an advocate. You're not in there, advocating for a position. You're trying to apply the law and do something fair if you can. And I think there's definitely a learning curve. For me, the learning curve in the juvenile court was not a long one. That was a place I felt comfortable almost the day I set foot in there. I really liked the process. I like being able to deal with the kids. I like being able to talk to them. It's much less formalized, as you know, than the rest of the system, and that's probably what I'm probably better at that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you to describe the process.
It is, and the law. You apply the law. It's this, you still have to prove larceny. You still have to do, but it's a different atmosphere. It's primarily a closed courtroom. You don't have the crowds. You're either dealing with people's custody issues or their support issues, or very important issues. What's more important than dealing with a family, and who gets the children, or where do you send this child to Beaumont, or do you try and find a local program for them? And I really felt like and I was only there for 2 years before I went to the circuit court, but I really felt like I had made a difference in some kids' lives there. And that, I know I heard from people for years afterwards. You'd get Christmas cards, and you'd get. I remember I had one kid. And actually, he was charged with armed robbery, redheaded kid from Leesburg. And it wasn't, in the term of robberies, it wasn't a terrible robbery, but it was a robbery. And I ended up working with him a little bit, and he sent him down to Beaumont on one and got him back and whatever. And about 10 years later, I got a Christmas card from him with his family. He owned a painting business and, employed 17 people. Those are the kinds of wins that just make it fabulous, and, life is difficult. And I remember in one case that I always give it as an example when I was talking to new judges, where you can apply the law absolutely correctly and have results that are nothing like you think. And it was early on in they called the UCCJA, the Uniform Child Custody Jurisdiction Act, and it was a parental kidnapping that took place. The mother took the child from the father, who was in England, and I think they were from Lebanon, and brought him to America and Fairfax County, and she was alleging a number of things, but the primary thing was it was basically just safer here and too dangerous to be where they were. Well, that doesn't cut it under the Act. The Act has very specific things you have to do, and I think her new husband was in the CIA or one of the services, and it was a dangerous place. But you can't take children from people because they live in dangerous places. And so we go through and we have the hearings, and the law is clear. And I say, well, I understand why you did it, but the children have to go back with their father, and you can't kidnap them. And so they did. And they went back to Lebanon, and about 2 weeks later, they had the bombing in Beirut of the Marine barracks there. These kids went to the American school, very close to the Marine barracks. They lived in this little area, and I thought, oh my gosh, I've done everything you're supposed to do under the law, but have I put these children in an environment that's dangerous for them, you know? I mean, and I have to say, you know, as a judge, you try and do the best you can, but you can't worry about it afterwards or you can't do your job. But I ran into the lawyer who represented the father several months later, and I just said to him, I said, you know, how are the kids? And I said, you know, where are they? And they said, oh, they never went back to Beirut. They had a farm someplace else, and, you know, they were... So I had worried for nothing. But that is an issue where, you know, you make decisions that affect people's lives, and you just have to do the best you can under what the law is.
The juvenile court also kind of opened you up to more public scrutiny. There were, in some cases, newspaper articles. How did you adjust to this increasing public scrutiny?
Well, I think that was really more in the circuit court. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the juvenile court's pretty closed. I had a lot of very, I guess you would say, public cases, you know, and some I've had, you know, the Occoquan down zoning case was a huge, as a new judge, and I was a new circuit court judge, that was a honey of a case to get. I had the Melissa Brannon kidnapping case, which was, you know, a very big media case before there really was all the media issues to deal with. And I have to say, I really tried not to pay a whole lot of attention to the good and the bad. You know, sometimes there'll be articles that say you're the greatest thing since sliced bread, and another you'll, you know, have to suppress a confession because that's what you have to do, and then, you know, you're this judge that wants to put criminals on the street. But I think if you get too involved with your own press, either good or bad, it impacts your ability to do the job right. I guess the only thing I can say that really, I got very annoyed once because I did this Occoquan down zoning that went on. It was a very complicated case, and really the trial was almost 9 months, 4 days a week for 9 months. And at the end of it, I took my entire summer vacation, like a month. I had a month of vacation time that was in there. And I took that month to write the opinion in that case. And so I was at home surrounded by boxes that you couldn't believe and briefs and whatever it is. And about 2 weeks after the case was over, there was a reporter who had followed it for the whole time. And they would have little updates about it and everything. And the guy put in there a line that said, Judge Fiztpatrick is still mulling over the outcome of the case. And I wanted to just, if I could have found that guy right then, I would have just shook, you know, mulling over. I'm sitting there trying to write this opinion that makes sense to somebody on my only vacation you get for the year, right? But I think people just don't understand the process. And, you know, I got over it. We got the opinion out. No mulling. It was over with. But I really do think that if you get too involved with your own press, it just, you know, it's a duck on your back, too hard to deal with.
The reason I brought that out is that this is the time period, the early 80s, when there was a concentration by the media on how judges were handling cases involving, whether it was juvenile or an adult, but criminal behavior. And so I saw a few early articles because there were some juveniles who did, although they were unnamed, they did get into some trouble and went before your court. But 82 was an interesting year because this is when Virginia was mulling over who would be appointed to the circuit court, and I want to know your take on.
You mean in Fairfax?
Yes. Yes.
Well, that was an adventure.
So tell me a little bit about that.
I was actually very happy on the juvenile court, and then a seat came up on the circuit court. 2 seats came up, and I sort of got encouragement to do this. I think Barbara got encouragement. I mean, there were a lot of people that wanted those seats. And it was very different than the general district court seats. In the old days, I think they were much more politically, they were plumb. And there were, I think, some people who looked to have a leg up on the seats. I had kind of the take on me, I had done very little jury trials. I mean, that's not what I did, and that was part of what was in there. They had, and I'm trying to think back on it, but Fairfax had a judicial selection process, then one of the few in the state, and they had a judicial selection group that you went through, and then you went through the bar. And I think, I can't even remember who it was, but at the end of the day, I was not voted as qualified because I had no jury trial experience. And I think, people would say, like, well, jury trials are the easiest things you do on a court. But I think if you're looking at the ultimate scheme of things, they don't really want somebody that's, those days, a legal aid lawyer who had little jury trial experience. Although Dick Jamborski was on the circuit court, and he had been a legal aid lawyer. But anyway, the long and the short of it is, I think it came out of the steering committee as I was not qualified. I think Barb was, and then a bunch of guys were, and then it went to the bar, and I think we all ended up okay at the bar. But it was still, I think probably I was at the end of the wagon, not the front of the wagon. But the way the decisions are made was there's a bar recommendation, but then you are interviewed by the legislators. And we went in to the legislators, and I have to say that's when I really like to talk to people. And at the end of the day, the legislators wanted me and Barb and Quinlan Hancock, and there were only 2 spots. And so they created a 3rd spot, and that's how I got there. And so, how did it happen? I don't really know how it happened, but I was glad it happened. And it just, I don't know, it just went that way. And then Barb and Quinlan started in January, and I started in July. So it was great.
What were your first experiences like? Because the 2 of you were really the first 2 women on the court here in Fairfax. And so tell me a little bit about...
Well, I think, it's like we talked before. I think in the beginning, people, it's a little bit, you're, a woman circuit court judge, it was a bit more of a big deal to go in there. It's a bigger stage. The cases are more complicated. There are all kinds of cases. And really nobody that goes on the trial bench has done every kind of case that comes through. They just don't. You can't. Some people, Tom Middleton, who was there, was a tax lawyer. Dick Jamborski had been a legal aid lawyer. Somebody else had been a land use lawyer. But the cases that come in are every kind of case. You're the last of the generalists. And what you really have to do is be smart enough, but really you have to be a worker so that you can figure out everything that needs to be done. And there is a learning curve. I think it probably takes most people a year before you're comfortable, because one day you have a felony, the next day you have a divorce, the next day you have a med mal case, and so it once you've done one, well, you're good to go. But it takes a while to sort of get it in there. So I think there is a learning curve. But my colleagues on the court were extraordinarily helpful to me. I kind of hit the ground running. I like seeing people. I loved, the ironic thing about the jury trial is I ended up being the jury person. I'm the person that instructs the juries. I just really enjoyed it. And I liked the interaction that came back and forth with the lawyers. Now, did I make mistakes? Absolutely. Does everybody else make mistakes? Absolutely. But you just try and do the best you can on each case that comes in. The woman thing, I think it was out there for a while. I'll tell you a story. When I first started, there was a group called Fathers United, and they were all the fathers who, really felt like they were getting the short end of the stick in custody cases. And they invited me to come and speak. And everybody said, oh, don't do it, it'll be off. And I said, no, I think we ought to send somebody over to talk to them. And I'm happy to go and do it. And so I went over to this meeting in Springfield, and it was an extraordinarily hostile group. primarily because I think maybe because I was a woman, but just at the court system altogether. And everybody had their own story of how they had gotten stiffed. I mean, and I'm not there to say they were true or not true, but everybody had their own story. And, once again, if you're at legal aid and you learn to listen, I think they wanted somebody to listen to them. And then at the end, they listened to me. And I said to them, I said, well, I heard what you said, but every judge on the court tries to decide the cases in the best way they can. And I said, but, I feel like you're saying like, well, how can I get a fair shake from a woman? And I said, let me tell you two things. I said, first of all, it seems to me that you're complaining about men. You've only got two choices. You've had men for the whole time. There's no way that I can do any worse than they've done, right? And I said, and the other thing is, I was raised by my father, and I thought he did a pretty good job. And that was sort of the showstopper. And after that, we had a very good dialogue. I mean, I can't say that it changed anybody's real feeling about, did they get a fair shake or not. But I think just the idea that somebody would come and listen to them made a difference. And I did do a lot of talking and speaking to groups over my years, well, on all the courts. But because I think it made a difference to people.
Mm-hmm. When you were on the court, were there any really difficult cases that I guess continue to be in your mind even today?
Well, I think I tried to treat every case that happened as the most important case I was ever going to see. I mean, I think because when people come to court, they don't come often, and it's really, and sometimes maybe once in a lifetime. So if you become kind of blasé or hierarchical about how you do things because, there's a $5 million in this and there's only $500 in this, I really tried not to do that. And I mean, I had very complex civil litigation, whether it was the Occoquan issue, which probably was the most complicated civil case I think I've ever seen. But to me, the most difficult cases were always those cases that maybe legally are not as difficult. Who gets the children? What happens to somebody's inheritance? Does this young man or woman go to the penitentiary for 5 years or 25 years? From a legal point of view, the law on that is not as complicated as maybe in a complex civil litigation case. But those are the cases that stay with me forever. What happened to that child? And, that you said, okay, you go with this parent and you get to see him in the summer. Did that work or did it not work? Mm-hmm. What happened to that young man that you said, okay, I think there's a chance to redeem you. You get 5 years instead of 15 years. I mean, those are the kinds of cases that affect people's lives so directly are the ones that stay with me. Do I remember the cases where, there was $1 million house and the floor wasn't straight and the bathtub was cracked? I tried to give that case as much attention as any other one. But after it was over, they went on and moved into the house or they sold the house or whatever. And in the cases that affected people from a personal point of view, those are the ones I think about. And I think you can't dwell on them because the next day something else comes in. But you just try to do the best job you can and hope it works. I mean, nobody's a seer that can say every decision you make is right. And some of them have a parenthesis around them because the law only lets you do certain things, and you have to do those. Well, the Occoquan, I'm a legal aid lawyer, right? I wasn't a zoning lawyer. And I had no idea about zoning when I went on the circuit court, like most judges. But our chief judge at that time came to see me after I'd been on probably, not even a year, and said, Joanna, there's a case out there that some of the judges have had to recuse themselves from, would you take it? And, my thought was always, they pay you to do whatever comes in the door. You don't necessarily get to pick. You don't whine. You just take what comes in. I said, sure, Barney, I'll take the case. What's it about? He says, it's a land use case. And I said, okay. So about 15 minutes later, they wheeled down like 19 carts full of briefs and pages and whatever it was. And it turned out the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors had downzoned a quarter of the county for, they had their reasons, but it was a tremendous economic disaster for many of the builders there. They had 5-acre zoning in much of the county, and there were issues: due process, equal protection. There was no constitutional issue that was not involved in this case. And but what it taught me as a judge is that you can do anything. You can learn anything. It reminded me of being back at Tufts and going to be a doctor, because I learned everything there had to do about water modeling and every scientific aspect of it that could be there. And at the end of the day, we had a decision that no one appealed. And I became the zoning expert in Fairfax County. So from a judge's point of view, it was a great case to have, because there'll never be another one that will be more of a challenge to me, because it had everything in it. And it just was I think it turned out to be a great gift. Maybe not what Judge Jennings intended in the beginning, but for me it was a great gift, because I learned I could do anything. There wasn't any case that could come in that I couldn't, if I worked at it, couldn't get it done.
Let me ask you kind of a follow-up with that. What was your typical day like as a circuit court judge?
In Fairfax.
Mm-hmm.
I usually got there between 8:30 and 9 in the morning. We didn't start court until 10 at that time. I would chat with my colleagues in one way or another, have a cup of coffee. I really liked the people that I worked with. I've been extremely fortunate to work with just, I think, great people. You get your, in those days, you'd get your case assigned usually that morning. It was all assigned by the chief judge, was not computerized or anything like that. And so you never knew what you got. You might show up and you get, a felony case, or it might be a divorce case, it might be a one-day case. You just didn't know. But generally you got them that morning. They didn't usually do them the day before. And so you'd go in and thumb through them as quick as you can and try and figure out who's on first. And if it's a jury trial, start thinking about what the issues might be on it. And then you'd start at 10 o'clock, go until about maybe 11:15, take a short break, come back, have lunch from 1 to 2, and then end at 4:30 in the afternoon, and then try and get ready for the next day, what it was. But Fairfax has always been a busy jurisdiction. So if your case settled, there was usually something holding that would come in. It was rare that, I could always tell people, they would say my hair color would change, because it'd be a long time between when I'd find time to go get my hair done. You couldn't get you just never had any time to do anything during the day. And we all had lunch together as a general rule, in that they had a judge's dining room there. So that was good, because that really, I think, promoted collegiality. And you could talk about cases and issues and, people's just issues that came up, as well as personal part things. And so we were really, I think, a very close bunch there. There are now about 15 judges. At that time it was 10 or 11.
When you were on the circuit court, did you all have any assistants, any law clerks or anyone who worked with you, and did you see any of that change over the years?
In the beginning, when I started, I think we had 2 law clerks for the whole court. And their role...
With how many people?
And I think, golly, I can't even remember now. I think maybe there were 10 judges, maybe 8, but there were a lot of judges. And their role was really, I would say, almost ministerial. They would check I wouldn't say they do a lot of research or anything like that. They would check in a divorce case, are the pleadings properly filed? Was the answer timely? Those kinds of things. And the first little bit of time, some judges, I don't think, use the law clerks much at all, particularly the older ones, because they just weren't used to having them. And then it expanded to 3 law clerks for, let's say, 10 judges. And you kept using them a little bit more. And then when I was doing that Occoquan case, I had 1 law clerk. Her name was Julie Tingwall, wonderful young woman. She was a clerk for maybe 3 judges. I think by that time we had divided them up, you know, one for 3 specific judges. And she did do some research for me, a lot of research for me on those issues. And then by the time I left there, everybody had their own law clerk. And so I think it definitely evolved. You know, the cases got more complicated. I mean, life is more complicated today.